Hi, everybody. My name is Frances Hasso. I'm an editor of the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, and I am a faculty member at Duke University in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, and the History Department, and the Sociology Department. So I am pleased to be chairing this panel, and among my tasks will be to be a timekeeper. Each person will present for 15 minutes, and I'll be using my friendly timer and give all of them a 1-minute warning. And if I have to cut them off, it will not be personal. It's because we want to have a great discussion, and they can't tell you everything they know during the presentation. If you could do us a favor and turn off your cell phones and anything that's likely to ring and be disturbing during the event, that would be great. So what I'm going to do is introduce each speaker right before they speak, and I'm going to sit there so that I can listen to them because I haven't read or heard the papers, and then I'll come back up to introduce the next person. So our first presenter is Patrick Haddad, who is an MA student of English Literature at the Department of English at AUB. He is the founder and first president of the Gender and Sexuality Club here at AUB, and his fields of research include Arab modernity, the Nahda, and queer fiction. Please join me in welcoming. Naam.
Okay, perfect. Hello everyone, thank you for coming. So my paper is titled Friendship as a Way of Life, Foucault, Queer Friendship, and Rabia Alameddin's Kool-Aids. In this paper, through a reading of Kool-Aids, The Art of War by Rabia Alameddin, I argue that Foucault's friendship as a way of life can be relevant politically, as a way of thinking of queer kinship ties outside of the structure of the NGOized community. Foucault, writing in the gay leftist magazine Gay Pied, theorized on the political possibilities of friendship and friendship as a way of life, which I argue is meant to present an alternative to the commercialization of the gay male community in Paris. Through a comparison between the Lebanese civil war and the AIDS epidemic in the States, Alameddin posited that these two events are similarly traumatic for gay men in Lebanon. I believe that Friendship as a Way of Life, Foucault, AIDS, and the Politics of Shared Estrangement by Tom Roach can help us understand how we can view the AIDS epidemic as a shared traumatic event which can provide political possibilities of personal alliances and friendships, and thus similarly how healing from the devastation of the Lebanese civil war through the formation of these Foucauldian friendships can provide the same catharsis. Finally, I will be discussing the Didier Eribon's chapter also titled Friendship as a Way of Life in his book Insult at the Making of the Gay Self, in light and in reference to Foucault's essay and Alameddin's book, to formulate an understanding of Beirut as a site where new kinship ties can be formed. In conclusion, understanding Kool-Aids using the lens provided by Foucault, that of friendship being a primary foundation and kinship marker for the gay male community, will unearth a unique reading of Alameddin's book, and I believe an argument into the political possibilities of gay friendship. In his magnum opus, Kool-Aids, The Art of War, Rabia Alameddin issues the first serious challenge against the Lebanese heteronormative familial structure in fiction. In the pastiche-style novel, Alameddin chronicles the tales of two families, the first centered around Lebanon and the second in the USA. Yet these two families are by no means exclusive to each other. The protagonist Muhammad, his sister, and his sister's friend Marwa continuously cross over throughout Kool-Aids, aided by the nonlinear narrative structure of the novel. Moreover, the family centered in the US is comprised mainly of LGBT people, and I will return to this point later on in order to catalog and better understand the US family and its radical critique against the heteronormative familial structure. Thus, Alameddin throughout the novel queers the traditional formulations of family, first by challenging Muhammad's relationship with his father. However, the challenge to the father is not remotely exclusive to the parent. As citizenship in Lebanon is constituted through the patriarch. Thus, in challenging the father, Muhammad challenges his citizenship, his nationality, and the state apparatuses that are connected to it. Secondly, due to Muhammad's dismissal of his birth family and adoption of his LGBT family, he is queering family by literally replacing the roles in the traditional heteronormative family structure with gay male surrogates. My goal throughout this paper will be to query the structure of this LGBT family, question its historical significance in LGBT history and Lebanese history, and make a claim how this form of kinship making is essential as a way of life or politics of the daily life. In short, how the queer family in Rabia Alameddin School-Aids provides the praxis for overcoming local, regional, and international structures of oppression. Thus, it is relevant for me at this point to bring into light the article that inspired this paper. Michel Foucault's interview, Friendship as a Way of Life, conducted for the gay French magazine Gay Pied, addresses the friendships formed at the margins of a society. He contends that in reference to the gay community in France, that friendship as a tool to base political movements on is especially powerful. Very simply, he says, during war and equally in prison camps, you had soldiers and young officers who spent months and even years together. During World War I, men lived together completely, one on top of another. And for them, it was nothing at all, insofar as death was present and finally the devotion to one another and their services rendered were sanctioned by the play of life and death. In bringing up World War I, Foucault suggests that these kinship ties are formed at the margins of the state itself. When empires were sending their men to die, these young bodies, under ownership of the military-industrial complex, were united in their subjugation, not by enemy troops, but by their country's willingness to use them as pawns. As such, Foucault is highlighting that these kinship ties can only be formed by the bodies oppressed by the state, by the nation. As Foucault continues, what do we know about these emotional uproars and storms of feeling that took place in those times? One can wonder how, in these absurd and grotesque wars and infernal massacres, the men managed to hold on in spite of everything, through some emotional fabric, no doubt. I don't mean that it was because they were each other's lovers that they continued to fight, but honor, courage, not losing face, sacrifice, leaving the trench with the captain, all implied a very intense emotional tie. This is not to say, of course, that this political friendship that is able to overcome boundaries can only be formed by gay men. It is true that Foucault was talking in the context of the gay male community in France, and we are now in the context of Kool-Aids, but we are discussing all bodies undergoing manifold manipulation by the state apparatus. However, specifically in the context of gay men and in the context of Kool-Aids, and as Serene Hood argues in Sex and Love while talking of Kool-Aids, sex and love, whether gay or straight, serve as both literary strategies and social psychological border crossings. At this point, I would like to highlight the implication of these queer kinship ties and to contextualize them more fully in the urban life through Didier Eribon's Friendship as a Way of Life, An Insult and the Making of the Gay Self. In Insult, Eribon presents a philosophical treatise on the emergence of gay culture in France, notably Paris. Yet, his treatise is presented in a narrative, almost autobiographical style. In the third chapter, Friendship as a Way of Life, which is obviously a reference to Foucault's interview, he introduces the gay self after arriving to the urban sphere. Gay as well as lesbian sociability is founded on a practice, even a politics of friendship, on the necessity of making contacts, meeting people who could be friends and slowly building a circle of chosen relationships. As Henning Bech puts it, being together with other homosexuals allows one to mirror oneself in them and find self-affirmation. It allows one to share and interpret one's experiences. The network of friends and the associations, together with the pub and bar, are the most important social institutions in the homosexual's life. Only through these is it possible to develop a more concrete and more positive identity as a homosexual. Taking us away from World War I, Eribon discloses that the exile of the homosexual from their native community to the urban space is, in of itself, worthwhile to consider as the prologue in the creation of the kinship ties, as the creation of the queer kinship ties. Even while we discuss literal exiles due to war and conflict, such as is the case in many Lebanese post-war narratives, we must keep in mind that the borders we cross may not only be geographical. The notion that border crossings is not a straightforward act of geographical relocation, as Hout argues in Sex and Love, and that sexual and or amorous relationships create for many Lebanese male and some female characters a proverbial borderland with openings to new sites of being and belonging, but also of well-being. Thus, the homosexual's arrival to the urban life may be a literal geographical exile for some, as is Muhammad's case in Kool-Aid's. But what is relevant for us is that it is a proverbial crossing over from the rural familial structure to a new site of being and belonging, mainly a new hope, ripe with new kinship ties and queer family structure. And yet, as we are talking of the validity of these kinship ties, their Foucauldian material conditions, their geographical movements from rural to urban, from war-torn Beirut to San Francisco, and their implications on gay livelihoods, we must keep in mind that this form of friendship is shown in Kool-Aid's and Turah al-Madin's linking of the AIDS epidemic and the Civil War. We are offered the opportunity to cross over the politics of friendship from one context, of the AIDS epidemic, to the Lebanese Civil War. Returning to our primary text, Rabia al-Madin's Kool-Aid's presents simultaneously two overreaching narratives of alienation and marginalization. The first being the AIDS epidemic, generally focused around the USA, and the second being the Lebanese Civil War, generally focused around Lebanon. However, these two narratives are not exclusive. In fact, I argue that al-Madin posited them together in order to bring a shared critique of the juridical, medical, military system discussed above, as well as to allow for a politics of shared estrangement, or a politics of friendship to govern the recovery and modalities of life after these two events. The Lebanese Civil War and the AIDS epidemic are by no means exclusive in the different narratives of the characters. However, several characters cross over, such as Muhammad, his sister, and Marwa, who survived the war only to be reconstituted in the queer family structure formed by the gay kinship ties. The different entries in Kool-Aid's may be seen as ambiguous and their authorship contested, and I believe that al-Madin links together the Civil War and the AIDS epidemic through employing the ambiguity of the entries in blurring the lines between the different narrators. This alliance between straight identifying people and gay identifying people in the wake of the AIDS epidemic is not a new concept brought up by al-Madin, such as the friendship between Marwa, Muhammad, and his sister. Nor has the concept of friendship as a political tool been hitherto missing from the gay community in the wake of the AIDS epidemic. In Friendship as a Way of Life, Foucault aids in the politics of shared estrangement, also a reference to Foucault's interview. Tom Roach investigates the early years of the AIDS epidemic and the subsequent reaction of the gay male community. In the early 1980s, AIDS Service Organization responded to such discrimination of categorizing AIDS as a disease only affecting homosexual people by emphasizing the human devastation wrought by AIDS and by delinking HIV from sexual identity. Specifically, the AIDS body system strategically shifted the discursive terms of AIDS politics from sexuality to friendship. Guided by an ethics of discomfort, this support network, I argue, sets the stage for a politics of friendship as a shared estrangement in later AIDS activism. As a collaborative project that communized caregiving, the buddy system engenders a biopower from below, providing an alternative to the often prejudiced healthcare of AIDS-phobic medical institutions and fostering new forms of cooperation between the sick and the healthy, between the gay-identified and the straight-identified. Roach highlights exactly the critique that I believe al-Madin is ushering in Kool-Aid's. The communized caregiving typified by Muhammad's closely knit queer family ties as he succumbs to the effects of AIDS is exemplar of the buddy system ushered in by groups such as ACT UP. This buddy system, which is a politics of friendship as shared estrangement, that has developed in the later stages of gay AIDS activism, provided an alternative healthcare to a prejudiced medical institution. Furthermore, these new political alliances changed not only the context of AIDS recovery, but created a queer solidarity. When Muhammad relocates to the US, he forms, through the myriad bonds of friendship, love, and sex, a diverse family that cares for its members, offers support, understanding, and essentially a new gay identity that acts as a protective shield from the fields of oppression that encumber them, and as a recourse from the ravages of war and AIDS. Muhammad and his sister, Marwa, James, Scott, Kurt, Ben, and Steve, all characters throughout the book, interact throughout the novel to form these queer kinship ties and new family structures. After hosting his first gallery show at 21, Muhammad had a review about him which outed him to the whole world as a gay artist. In one stroke, Muhammad was exiled from his father, from his family, and from the fatherland, but he was not left alone. Muhammad called Scott immediately and asked him to move in. This act of surrogacy creates the first foundation of the new queer family. After being alienated from the heteronormative family structure, Muhammad instinctively seeks out Scott and creates a new family that will last for the duration of the novel, to the joy of its ever-increasing members. Muhammad himself becomes Scott's support against an oppressive medical institution. When a doctor informed Scott that he was not getting any better and that he probably has, quote, AIDS dementia, Muhammad stormed into the doctor's office and forced the doctor to flee. It is at this point that the queer friendship between Muhammad and Scott is finalized and politically utilized for the shared benefit of the new queer family. So in conclusion, however, this has several noteworthy implications on our reading of Rabi' Alameddin's Kool-Aids. Firstly, through the linking of the AIDS epidemic and the Civil War, I feel confident in saying that Alameddin not only solidifies and validates a politics of friendship to form in the wake of the Civil War nostalgia, but a queer politics of friendship is essential in any post-Civil War catharsis. This would include a politics of solidarity between those completely marginalized by the redistribution of wealth and resources in the wake of the Civil War, a commemoration of those who departed us, and the remembrance of every point of the war, in the vein of Muhammad recounting his life story on his deathbed. Furthermore, throughout this new mode of life, we must realize that the political possibilities of these kinship ties are many. First, as I have mentioned, the restructuring of traditional forms of families into queer families goes against the oppressive tactics employed by the state apparatus, and therefore need to be emphasized in our communities. And second, we must also think of LGBT communities outside of the structure of LGBT community building and allow for the organic bonds formed by queer friendship to appear as a foundation instead. Thank you.
It's like you were perfect.
Timed myself.
Can I use your phone? Can I use your phone?
Yes.
You're shutting down.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, press start.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
So the next speaker is Jade Musa, and I hadn't given the title for Patrick's paper, but he had, and it's in your program. Jade's title is Queering the Middle Eastern Queer, on how the Western queer discourse limits the queer Arab man's identity. Jade is currently a master's candidate in advanced international studies at the Diplomatic Academy. He's of Lebanese origin and is interested in the intersection of gender, language, and biology. He's currently working on the historiography of sexual chromosomes and their effect on the solidification of gender norms. His thesis will look over the interplay of biology and queer theory to discuss the reality of gender as pseudo-biology. As a Lebanese queer individual, he believes that the Arab queer identity, or the queer Arab identity, should develop independently of Western influence and create a center for non-white queerness through the Arabic language. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay. Thank you for the introduction. So, as already mentioned, my research is titled Queering the Middle Eastern Queer, How the Western Queer Discourse Limits the queer Arab Man's Identity. So I was mainly interested in looking at the interactions of West versus East, and how the general question that framed this research was, what are these interactions between Western queer discourse and queer men in the Arab world? And as we know, queerness is a term that has evolved quite rapidly throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, starting with just a term in German language to becoming a slur against homosexual individuals later on, and then becoming a political term. And today, to identify as queer insinuates a visibility within the community that distinguishes oneself from the mainstream and insists on one's individualism as viewed by the rest of society. And this definition became central to the Western queer discourse, especially during the 80s, after being inspired by the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, and because of the AIDS epidemics of the 1980s. There was this desire by the LGBT movement and the queer activists to identify themselves and make themselves visible. So there was this trend of using identity as a definition for visibility. And this became part of a certain infrastructure for Western queer discourse that became necessary for the evolution of the individual as himself and the community as a network. And this led me to ask the following thesis: does the adoption of Western standards of queerness actually liberate and validate the identity of the queer individual, especially in an environment that lacks the infrastructure for such an accelerated growth? Because as we see in the West, the coming out, for example, liberates the individual and makes him part of the queer society. And does that apply for societies such as the Levant? And before moving on to further to my argument, I would just like to define quickly certain terms that are necessary. So queer, as I already mentioned, it's an umbrella term that refers to LGBT plus communities in general, and it's quite political in nature. For the sake of my research, I used it in two different ways. The first one, which is among the Arab communities, it was used to define men who have sex with men regardless of their identity, how they identify themselves, whether homosexual, bisexual, or other. And within the context of the West community, queerness was used as a term to define general queer culture. So this queer culture becomes, in the West, creates a performative. And according to Judith Butler, performativity is the societal constructs imposed on an individual by which he abides and defines its behavior. So in the context of queerness, even though queerness came out as an antagonist to the mainstream, there was this performative that was created as a consequence, a set of rules that white queers and Western queers have to abide by. And this performative becomes a certain culture. And among these different aspects of this culture is the coming out. So coming out is a procedure or event during which a queer individual asserts his identity publicly for the first time. So my methodology was mainly based on ethnographies that were already done. The main one that I used was Queer Beirut by Soufiane Mirabet. And surprisingly, in his book, he actually mentions that Queer Beirut is one of the first and only ethnographies on queerness in the Middle East. And this is an issue because a lot of the discourse that's happening about the Middle Eastern queer is done by white, Western-centric narratives. And this was one of the limitations of my research. So my independent variable was the Western queer discourse versus my dependent variable, which was the queer Levantine men's identity. So going back to my argument, I started with the queer discourse and its expectations. And the queer theory has been adopted by a globalized LGBT movement, which was moving rapidly into the mainstream. And it was mainly fighting for gay rights and marriage equality, and pushed for a new civilized society that accepts individuals that assert non-heterosexual identities. So this queer performative has emerged from the recent years of queer discourse and queer activism to establish a community that opposes the heterosexual cisgendered mainstream. And these movements have pushed for a more liberal acceptance of LGBT plus individuals within each of their countries. And the West sought to create a space for the validation of queer individuals and their identities, and to establish gay rights movements across these communities. So in this becoming part of the Western communities through the phenomenon of coming out yields to the creation of an us and a them, and where the term gay becomes a positive assertion of their solidarity to your us. So for you to become a part of this Western community and of this Western queer community, coming out was a necessary step of the culture. Yes, they are here to support even individuals that do not want to come out, but for you to become visible, to be able to claim your rights, coming out and becoming visible in the community was necessary. And this was part of as I already mentioned, a natural growth for the Western community because they were fighting for their rights. So the individual, it is the act that is necessary, and the aftermath is met with strength and support from the community, whether present physically in the individual's entourage or through other methods, such as online presence. So the individual comes before the context. The individual comes first. Yes, later on there will be a community to support you, but you have to put yourself out there. There's a sense of community that imposes itself on the members, yet pushes each individual to affirm and proclaim their own identity. But this clashes with the reality of Middle Eastern queer men, because encompassing them with a Western us and separating them from their patriarchal society does not necessarily liberate them or fortify them, or fortify their identity. Western queer discourse and identities are being adopted due to an imposed missionary role of liberalization, and these formations override the narratives of the individuals. There is a co-opting of the intricacies and experiences of every single Arab queer man. The academic accounts of social and anthropological behavior in queer Middle Eastern studies or texts have been written by an overwhelming majority of white gay American or European scholars who have diminished the Arab men's experience to fit their model of liberalization or liberation. So this creates, and as we know, Middle Eastern communities are based on communal ties first, which goes against this Western concept of individuality. Families and environments are more important than the declaration of your own visibility as a queer man in the Middle East. And we can see that, for example, within the relationship between individuals, between kids and their parents, when in the Middle East it's really rare, it's not rare, but it's not common for individuals to leave their parents' house too early, or when it comes, for example, to religious marriages, where there are certain ideas that parents have for their children when it comes to matrimony. So these communal ties clash with Western individualism. When Western queer sexual discourse overrides details of everyday Middle Eastern life and dismisses any insight into the everyday life of young queer Arab men, it exports neoliberal and neo-imperial behaviors that impose an assimilation of all experiences and universalize all unique LGBT plus identities of this non-Western sphere. So Salim Haddad, in one of his articles entitled The Myth of the Queer Arab Life, denounces the Western discourse of using and abusing the queer Arab body for their own agendas. So this happens sometimes through sociosemantics. And I argue that the Arab language is not properly adapted to the sexual and gender terminology that were coined in the West decades ago. It is more common for queer communities in the Middle East to use language in English rather than in Arabic when communicating about these theories or this activism. And this creates an imperial imposition of Western queer semantics that continues the tradition of misrepresenting the queer identity of Arab queer men, where many a Western academic have made language-based mistakes and errors when analyzing queer and sexual semantics in Arabic. So the integration of Western queer ideas and vocabulary into the Arabic language and the vernacular of Levantine men transforms the gay or queer identity from what it entails, usually a connotation of individual, most commonly cis male, who engages into sexual relations with other male and might be comfortable or not in his homosexuality, to a new sense of limitation where the standard of gay imposes a certain stereotype and performative on the individual. So the lack of understanding of the nature of homosexuality in homoromantic relationships forces families to assume that gayness to be a feminine, weak performance and failure in the nurture of the son. This is a creation of stereotypes onto queer Arab men and the imposition only of stereotypes rather than the liberative aspect of these Western semantics. So we can see that as well, for example, in the Psychiatrist Association of Lebanon that only denied that homosexuality was a sickness in 2014, and despite that, there were still a lot of clashes within queer communities in the Levant. So in fact, even within the gay community, there are certain expectations that come with the label of gay, and sourcing from internalized homophobia and misogyny and deeply rooted in patriarchy and masculinity, the behavior of certain queer males within the homosexual sphere in the Middle East is similar to the homophobia in the community of the West, but even more exaggerated. Unquestionably, though, there has been progress in the last few years. We cannot deny that. Globalization, the access to mass media and pop culture, have expedited the educative process where individuals of all generations across the globe are becoming more aware of queer sexual identities. Nevertheless, the stigma of having a son associated with a stereotype destroys the pride of the family, as it would be seen as a failure in parenting and a lack of communal and familial support. Due to the commercialization of the gay identity and semantics, combined with the import of Western queer vocabulary and stereotypical portrayal of LGBT plus individuals on mainstream TV in the Middle East, the queer vernaculars used among the men in the community and among family members when discussing the homosexual phenomenon portray subconsciously an image of weakness, femininity, and non-natural sexual behaviors. Therefore, the phenomenon of coming out is purely a Western queer performative that bolsters the dismissal of people of color queer identities and orientalizes their experience, which borderlines on the pinkwashing aspect. This leads to my discussion of failure of the Western queer discourse, and Western ideals of queerness do impose a demarcation on the person's identity as a push towards emancipation from societal standards. While Western culture is not exempt from cases of homophobia and misogyny or imposed performativity on queer male bodies, there is still a large space left for an individual's personal growth, and for his own body, his own identity, and his own visibility. On the other hand, a demarcation of one's identity in an environment such as the Levantine world does not necessarily give the individual space to a supportive community as seen in the West. In fact, there is a lack of a community when it comes to queerness. Moreover, this queer male body, after asserting his identity, would lead to his ousting from the general community. Consequently, the queer community in the Middle East is more of a sphere of influence that is loosely based on Western queer standards and is not supported by the infrastructure that is observed in the West. The development of gay or queer identity is assumed to be done through an imposition of the sexuality as a primary aspect of one's personality, and where acceptance of the family is only secondary. This is what's happening in the West. One's existence in the Western queer community is defined by their identity and the assertion of their visibility. However, with globalization and this increased awareness of homosexuality seeps into the Middle Eastern sphere through stereotypes adopted from movies, series, and publicized events, and shapes a label of queerness, gayness based on misogynist understanding of masculinity. By insisting on this discord, the West perpetuates a sexual binary, and their impositions does not liberate the Arab queers, nor make their visibility an empowerment tool. They bolster a rigidity in queer Arab identity and vocabulary formation, permitting the few recently created Arab words to imply the negative stereotype of the gay man, and further alienates individuals from contributing to the general gay rights movement. So it's important still to understand that there are exceptions to every single theory and every single aspect. And a major one that I found was Salim Haddad's recent book, Guapa, which discusses the experience of an Arab queer man that leaves his Arab nation to the United States to study there and rediscovers himself. So in this context, it does affect, the Western discourse does indeed bolster certain individuals that are able to reach the West and that abide by certain neo-bourgeois individuals. So if we look, for example, within the Lebanese community, there is definitely a different experience for every single individual, and generalizations hurts that. So in Lebanon, religion and class are intersectioned, and every single level of, if a person is Christian and rich, for example, from a high class, has a completely different experience from someone who is Muslim from a high class, and that goes as well with, for example, from a lower class. So, in conclusion, there are a lot of limitations to this research overall. Mainly, it's the lack of ethnographies that are being done in the Middle East and the generalization of narratives. The Western queer representation of Middle Eastern men has always erased these peculiarities and differences that shape their position within their domestic societies and the international sphere, avoiding any discussion of the intersections of class, race, and sect. This research overviewed the effects of Western queer discourse on the identity of queer Arab men through the usage of Western semantics and the coming out experience. So by imposing these values and by letting them seep into the community, queer Arab bodies are thus portrayed as straight acting or conforming to gender performances to avoid shame and public humiliations, since families come first and the pride of the family comes first. But despite the limitations, the concentration on the narratives of Levantan queer men, this analysis of the effects of Western queer discourse leads to. Can I just say one sentence though? Okay. So I just wanted to actually end on these last two sentences. This was what I was going to say. The Middle East and the Muslim world are definitely not perfect nor safe havens for gay men, but it's still important to criticize the discourses constantly imported from the West and globalized through mass media and popular TV shows. And I love this sentence by these two authors, Amara and Al-Shakri: queer resistance and sexual counter-politics are imaginable in the Middle East. Thank you.
This was his first academic presentation, and he did fantastic. I am going to introduce Maha Aburaya with Maha because I only have one segment of a sentence, which says she is an assistant professor of sociology at عجمان University بالإمارات. So احكي لي بدك تحكي لي أي شيء
لا،
على
بس أوكي.
what's your research focus?
gender and many يعني أكتر من مجال في الدراسات النوعية في التنمية المستدامة. في الجندر يمكن ده تاني بس بحث عندي.
Okay, so she said, yeah, I don't know how to mess with this. What do you? No, I want you. استني شوي. Oh, how do I make this work? Okay. There. احكي مش بس إلهم. What's your إيش عن إيش بتبحثي؟
في دراسات النوع يمكن ده تاني بحث ليا بس في دراسات النوع وبرضو في التنمية المستدامة ويعني عندي أو أبحاثي في مجالات متخصصة. أنا أستاذ مساعد في جامعة عجمان وكنت في السعودية قبلها وطبعا أنا من مصر. وخلينا
So she's giving a paper titled Media Coverage of the Phenomenon of Boyats in Kuwaiti Society. Please join me in welcoming her.
شكرا كتير. النهارده ان شاء الله هياخد موضوع التناول الاعلامي لظاهره البويات في المجتمع الكويتي كمقاربه نسويه. يمكن هبتدي قبل ما ابتدي البحث هي القصه ليه اخترت الموضوع ده. انا كنت في مصر سنه 2012 ولقيت مؤتمر بيناقش نفس الموضوع فبدات ابحث فيه فلقيت ان قلت اوكي ممكن اشارك فيه وانا في مصر. فلقيت الظاهره في الصحف موجوده في الصحف الكويتيه تحديدا لان المؤتمر كان خاص في الكويت. فرجعت كده يعني بذاكرتي اشوف لان انا اصلا دارسه في السعوديه يعني من 1983 ل 1993 كنت اصلا كطالبه عايشه في السعوديه. فقلت الظاهره دي ما كانتش موجوده كان بس في طالبه واحده كانت غريبه كده كانت قص شعرها قوي وكان دايما المدرسين بيكلموها وكنا بنستغرب ليه بس ما كناش نعرف. وقفت البحث ثم شاء القدر ان شاء الله ان انا اسافر بقى السعوديه والاقي الظاهره واعيش في وسط الظاهره دي تاني. لقيتها منتشره. انا لما سافرت السعوديه تاني 2014 كنت برضو استاذ مساعد في جامعه هناك فلقيت الظاهره منتشره جدا. فعشت بقى كون انت تقرا عن ظاهره ثم تعيش فيها وتلاقي ان كان في اختلاف مثلا من في خلال 20 سنه كانت مش موجوده وبعدين موجوده. أعتقد ده يثير الحس السوسيولوجي عند أي باحث اجتماعي. طبعا يعني المقدمة يمكن تكون هي أن احنا في مجتمعاتنا متعودين الأغلبية هم اللي هم الغالبية اللي هم الجنسية الغيرية لكن أيضا الجنسية المثلية موجودة وفي كل المجتمعات اللي هي بقى موجودة اللي هي ظاهرة البويات اللي هي يعني هم هناك بيسموها كده البويات وطبعا هشرح بعد كده جاي هذا الاسم منين. غالبا يعني انا في مصر ما لاحظتهاش رغم ان طبعا عايشه في مصر لكن لم الاحظ هذه الظاهره فكان برضو ان هي ربطت وكما قرات يعني في المراجع ان هي مربوطه بالمجتمعات العربيه ذات الطبيعه المغلقه اللي بتكون الفتيات لوحدها والشباب او الذكور لوحدهم. اخذت طبعا الاطار النظري عندي من الموجه الثانيه من النسويه في الراديكاليه اللي هو ان هو ده هل هذه الظاهره يعني بيعيشوها هناك ضد في يعني مرحله هل هم في مرحله النضال ضد نظام الادوار الجنسيه وازاي ان هم ده موجوده في هذه المجتمعات يعني بيضاف عليها الطابع المرضي زي ما فعلا اثبتت هذه النتائج اثبتت النتائج كده. يعني ايضا استخدمت بمقاربه الموقعيه النسويه او الستاند بوينت ابستمولوجي اللي هي علشان لما قرات عنها لقيت ان هي ممكن تديني دراسه يعني مفصله عن تجارب هذه الفتيات او هذه النساء من في هذه الفكرة. زي ما هو واضح البويات هو مصطلح يطلق على الإناث اللي بيمارسن الجنس مع أخريات من نفس النوع اللي هي الليسبن أو السحقية اللي هو بقى إيه جاي من كلمة بوي الإنجليش فحطوا لها أنثوها فبقت بويا وده المصطلح ده طبعا منتشر كتير هناك جدا وبيستخدم. الصورة دي أنا واخداها من مقالة من المقالات اللي طبعا غير مسموح إن احنا نصورهم او حتى ان احنا نتكلم معاهم او ندرس الظاهره او نتناقش معاهم في اي حاجه. طبعا انا بتكلم على كان في المجتمع السعودي انا لم اذهب الى المجتمع الكويتي لكن في الكويت يعني برضو لان انا تعرضت لاكثر من من مجتمع يعني وشفت وعشت ما بينهم، فهم الكويت اكتر حريه يمكن في الحديث وفي تناول اي موضوع تقريبا يعني من بقيه المجتمعات. فبقى زي ما قلنا كده بقت اسمها بيلقبوها ببويا، واحيانا بيسموهم جنس رابع بس مش يعني مش مدرك كتير، احيانا بيسموها مسترجله او فتاه مسترجله. ازاي او كيف تتحول برضو البنت البويا؟ ان هي اول حاجه بتبقى في المظهر، ان هي بس بتبتدي تلبس الملابس وبتبقى عندها رغبه، بعد كده الموضوع بيتحول للسلوكيات، تبدا ان هي في سلوكياتها، وزي ما هو واضح ان هي بتبقى في يعني سلوكياتها بتبقى طريقه المشيه، طريقه الاكل، النظره، حتى بتبقى يعني طبعا مختلفه. يعني في بنات بيبقوا قاصين شعرهم او حاجه او لابسين حتى ملابس رجالي او ملابس رياضيه، بس لا بيبقى معروف ان دول مثلا مش بويات، انما دول بيبقى لهم سلوكيات مختلفه. وبرده بناء على المراجع ان هي بتتحول بعد كده ممكن تتحول الى ممارسه جنسيه. برده هشوف من البحث هل في المجتمع اللي انا درسته هل المقالات بتوضح هذه الفكره، هل في اي مرحله من المراحل بتعتبر هذه البويه منهم. وطبعا برضو استعنت بدراسه ريتشارد عن ان هو الانماط اللي هو نمط هل هم في نمط الهجره ولا التارجح والتذبذب او نحو الازاله او التجاوز. يعني كنت عايزه ادرس اي مرحله من هذه المراحل بتعد البويات فيها. حاولت ان انا اجاوب على سؤالين، السؤال الاول اللي هو كيف يتم تمثيل البويات في الصحافه الكويتيه، والثاني ما التجربه التي تعيشها البويات بشان تصوراتهن عن ذواتهن. وده طبعا من اجل ان انا اوجه الانتباه لتجارب البويات بشان الواقع الاجتماعي اللي هم بيعيشوه. حاولت برضو ادخل او اللي هو من خلال بقى اللقاءات المقابلات المتعمقه ان انا ادخل في حياتهم واتكلم عنهم، منظورهم، هل بيشعروا بالرضا او عدم الرضا، هل بيشعروا بالغربه، هل بيشعروا بالعزله، بيشعروا بالاندماج. المنهجيه اللي انا اتبعتها وليه اتبعتها، الظاهرة موجودة ممكن ملاحظتها بمنتهى السهولة في يعني حتى في طبعا بالنسبة للسعودية داخل المدارس، لأن هناك يعني لابسين العبايات ومش واضح قوي. في المدارس بتبقى باينه، في الجامعات، في الاماكن برضو ممكن لما نروح هيئه او مؤسسه. بالنسبه يعني المجتمعات الثانيه برضو بيبقى واضح في الاماكن، حتى الاماكن العامه. للاسف لم اجد دراسات سابقه كتير في هذا الخصوص، فبالتالي لم استطع ان اقدر حجم الظاهره او ما كانش عندي احصائيات، لان تناول الظاهره كان غالبا زي ما قلت اللي هو في المقالات الصحفيه. حتى لما بدات ادخل على مجتمعات اخرى عشان اشوف حجم الظاهره او اشوف ماذا تحدثوا عن الظاهره، فوجدت ان هي بس في المقالات الصحفيه، احيانا برامج تلفزيونيه، حملات توعويه فقط. فبالتالي كان بحثي استكشافي، استخدمت فيه تحليل مضمون استقرائي اللي هو كيفي، يعني ما استخدمتش الكمي اللي هو باستخدام الارقام للدلالات وكده، علشان مزيد من اللي هو التعمق في المعاني الذاتيه وتامل التجارب اللي سواء كان بتعيشها البويات من منظور الآخرين. حاولت برضو اللي هو إجراء مقابلتين متعمقتين طبعا، وده كان منتهى السرية، يعني لأن مش زي ما قلت كده مش مسموح إن احنا نتكلم معاهم أو نجري معاهم حوارات. التحليل المضمون كان لصحيفة كويتية اللي لقيت فيها أكتر صحيفة، لقيت فيها يعني مقالات كان في الفترة من 1 يناير 2008 لأول يعني معلش عشان الخط يعني أول 6/2017. زي ما قلت كنت وقفت البحث وبعدين رجعت استكملته تاني. والمقابلتين ده طبعا عن ان هي منهجيه تحليل المضمون بتديني ميزتين، ان هي الماده طبيعيه موجوده غير تفاعليه، انا لا بأثر عليها ولا على المبحوثه ولا كده ولا على المعلومات ولا على البيانات، وبرضه هي غير تفاعليه، فبيديني نوع من انواع الموضوعيه علشان ادرس هذه العمليه. اخترت عينه زي ما اتفقنا اللي هو من 1/1/2008 ل1/6/2017، سواء كان في كلمه البويه في عنوانها الرئيسي او في الفرعي او في المحتوى النصي. بدات اجمعها طبعا، ده طبعا طريق الموقع الالكتروني، كانت الامور اسهل بكتير. صحيفه الوطن الكويتيه بدات احفظها، ولما حفظتها يعني حفظتها بهذا الشكل اللي هو وورد، علشان كده يمكن ما فيش يعني صور منها، علشان اقدر ان انا ارجع عن طريق اللينك اقدر ارجع بمنتهى البساطه. بدات بقى التصنيف او الترميز، وبرده يمكن الصوره واضحه. الترميز كان بالطريقه ديت، ان هي ما استخدمتش برده برنامج احصائي لان لم يكن هدفي احصائي. انا استخدمت عملت كود كده لمثلا السلوكيات البويات. عملت كود مثلا البويات وسجلت ماذا كتب عنهم. مثلا رأي الجنوس اللي هم الجيز او اللي هم الذكور المتحولين الاناث ماذا قالوا عنهم، الكاتب ماذا قال عنهم، الطالبات ماذا قال عنهم. فكانت دي الطريقه اللي قمت بيها، فلم يكن ابدا تحليل كمي. وكان لواحد يعني وصلت ل 21 مقاله. ده برضو كده يعني مختصر، ان كان في 11 مقاله كتبها ذكور، 6 كتبها اناث، 4 ما كانت معروضه يعني كخبر. السنوات النشر كانت اللي هي كانت في 2008 2009 2010، في عوام ما كانش فيها مقالات تقريبا. المقالات برضو كانت سلوكيات البوية كانت تقريبا جت في 8 مقالات، الرأي عن البويات جت في 3 مقالات، الرصد كظاهرة سلبية جت في مقالتين، التصدي للظاهرة جت ل8 مقالات، ان مشكلات موجودة في المجتمع ومن ضمنها البويات جت مثلا في مقالتين، ومقالة فيهم عن الجراحات تجميل وغيره. زي ما قلت برضو استعنت بالمقابلات غير محكمة البناء. يعني أنا سألت سؤالين فيهم بس: ما تصورك عن ذاتك وكيف يعاملك الآخرين، وسبت لها حرية إن هي تتكلم براحتها، لأن الموضوع حساس. الموضوع برضو مش عارفة هي هتتقبل ولا لا، لأن أنا كنت عاملة حسابي إن أنا 5 مثلا أوصل 5 أو 10، وطبعا كان في ناس بيرفضوا. لا مفيش، عادي يا دكتورة. كنت بسألها، كان بيبتدي الموضوع دايما: أنت ليه قصة شعرك كده، أنت ليه لابسة كده، فعادي يا دكتورة موضة. أو إن هي مثلا إيه تبدأ تتكلم اللي هي لو معتزة مثلا أو هي حاسة بهويتها. الإجابة عن بدأت بقى السؤال الرئيسي بدأت أقسمه: تصور الآخرين عن البويات، تصورهم عن إيه الممارسات اللي بيقوم بها البويات، كيف يتم التعامل المجتمعي بيهم. وطبعا أنا يعني عايزة أعرض ده كله بس عشان الوقت. يعني غالبا كان في مقالات كتيرة إن هي بيذكر اسم بويا. يمكن البوينت الرئيسي من هذه الشريحه ان هو في عندي 13 مقاله ما عرفتش ايه هي البويا، فمعنى كده ان هو يعني موجوده. برضو كان في راي عن داعيه ديني يتكلم في الموضوع، الطالبات المتخصصين. الاسباب اللي كانت لما بيذكر ان هي لماذا يوجد بويات في المجتمع الكويتي، كان العامل البيولوجي اقل عامل ركزوا عليه. كان بيركزوا برضو على العوامل النفسيه، العوامل النفس اجتماعيه. ظهرت عوامل اجتماعيه اللي هي طبعا الاسره وعدم تفرغ الوالدين، الاستعانه بالخادمات، والعوامل الاخلاقيه اللي ركزوا فيها على تراجع الدين وزياده الفضائيات وكده. الممارسات اللي كانت بتمارسها البوية هم كان من رأيهم اللي هو الميل إلى كل ما هو ذكوري في المظهر، في السلوكيات. ان هم الجنوس او الجيز كانوا بيقولوا ان هم فيهم رجولة وشهامة. الاستشارية النفسية كانت بتقول ان هم بياخدوا هرمونات علشان يتحولوا يعني. الطالبات اللي هم زميلات البويات كانوا بيخافوا منهم. كتاب المقالات كانت بيقولوا ان هي دايما بتحرص على اللبس فقط. يعني برضو كان في رأي ان هو دايما البوية بتمارس العنف، وده كان موجود في مقالات كتيرة جدا. كانت غالبا المقالات وضحت انه بتوصم بسمعة سيئة، ان هي دايما موجودة في مجموعات، ان هي لا توجد لوحدها. الرغبة في جذب الانتباه. طيب التعامل المجتمعي فيه كان في قبول من ناحيتين: قبول قد يتحول الى رغبه، وده ان هو كان في المقالات قالت ان كان في بنات قاعدين بنات قاعدين وحاولوا ان هم يعني يتكلموا مع بويا ويجذبوها. واحيانا كمان كان في اراء بتقول احنا متقبلينهم، دي حرياتهم الشخصيه، بس ما حدش يعني بعيد عننا يعني. برضو اللي هو المعاملة المجتمعية أو التعامل المجتمعي معهم كان أحيانا في صمت وتجاهل وعدم استنكار، أحيانا في تشجيع. والمقالات ركزت أن غالبا اللي بيشجع الموضوع ده الأطباء والصيادلة، أصحاب المقاهي والمطاعم اللي هم مستفيدين من تواجدهم، وأن على أساس وجودهم بيجي كمان ناس على يعني بنات تانيين عشان يتعرفوا بيهم. وصل الموضوع أن هو القبول، أن هو في دعوة للمناقشة وعلانية، وده لقيتها في مقالتين. أن هي بدأت الموضوع أن هو موضوع وظاهرة موجودة وعايزين نعالجها. هي بس برضو كان طبعا في رفض وخوف وإن هي بتمثل خطر اجتماعي يكون لازم العقاب. أيضا يعني كان في إقرار رسمي بوجود هذه الظاهرة، وحتى بدأ اللي هو أول أو آخر نتيجة هنا إن هم بدأوا اللي هو يطالبوا بحقهم في التصويت، بس دي طبعا لقيتها في مقالة واحدة. المقابلات الشخصية كان فيها برضو إحساسهم بالأنوثة، هم عدم إحساسهم بالأنوثة، تقبلهم لذاتهم، شعورهم باستقرارهم النفسي والارتياح، إن هم لا يرغبوا في تغيير واقعهم. وسبب كونها بويا إن هي ده بسبب اللي هي المجتمع الذكوري اللي بتعيش فيه، وإن هي بتحاول إن هي تحصل على الحرية وتتخلص من المراقبة. طيب يعني النهاية أو النتائج إن يوجد اعتراف ضمني بالظاهرة وبانتشارها، إن هو مسكوت عنه تصنيفهم، مسكوت عنه الاختلاف بينهم، فهم بيصنفوا ضمن فئة واحدة. ان اللي هو موجودين في المجتمع الكويتي على شكلين، اللي هو الرغبه في ارتداء الملابس بس، والسلوك الذكوري. يعني المقالات لم تذكر ان هم في علاقات كامله، ان هم ذات سلوك مثلي جنسي فقط. الاعتراف المجتمعي ان هم على الشخصيه والشكليه، لكن لا يعترفوا بالسمات البيولوجيه. اغلبيه المقالات بتؤكد ان هي انحراف يحتاج الى علاج، لكن داخل هذا الرفض يوجد التقبل ان العامل الاجتماعي والعامل النفسي. انا بقالي نص دقيقه لو تسمحي لي حضرتك. العامل الاجتماعي والعامل النفسي هم الاساس في هذه الظاهره. فبالتالي هذه القضية إلى حد كبير هي تعتبر قضية يعني مهملة بيتم تناولها، ولما يتم تناولها طبعا هو تناول إعلامي غير نسوي. فأنا بدأت أتساءل طيب البويات دول هل هيستمروا؟ لأن كانت معظم الملاحظات إن دي فترة مراهقة، لما يكبروا الموضوع هينتهي وهيبقوا يعني شخصيات عادية أو امرأة عادية. وبوصي بأبحاث مستقبلية عن دراسة النصوص الثقافية التي تتضمن تمثيلات متناقضة للبويات والتغيرات في المضمون المجتمعي للبويات. وأشكركم على سعة صدركم. السلام عليكم.
شكرا. ممكن أسألك، حكيتي بدي أعرف مين اللي ما يسمح. كم مرة حكيتي ما يسمح؟ She said a few times that somebody doesn't allow, إنه مش مسموح. بس ما حكيتي. You didn't say the subject, like مين اللي ما يسمح؟ يعني الحكومة أو المدارس أو البويات أو
لا، هو المجتمع يعني في المجتمع ككل، وخصوصا بقى داخل مجتمع الجامعه، لان انا هلاحظهم فين؟ انا لاحظتهم داخل المجتمع الجامعي نفسه. فداخل مجتمع الجامعه طبعا غير مسموح لنا ان احنا نعمل حتى ابحاث عن هذا الموضوع، ولا ان احنا نتكلم ونقف معايا. كان في ظاهره، كان في بنت كانت بقى اعتقد ان هي كانت وصلت لمراحل متقدمه، فدي كان ممنوع مننا خالص ان احنا نقترب منها.
يعني ممنوع الجامعه بتمنع؟
اوكي.
Okay, so I will take, maybe 3 comments or questions, and you be clear who you're directing them to, and then I'll open it up for the audience. For the panelists to respond. So the floor is open. Questions or comments? Yes.
Thank you all.
And basically, if I were to follow the earlier panel, you should say your name, identify yourself.
I'm Nana Isa. I'm an assistant professor at the English department here. Thank you for this panel. I have a question to all of you, different questions to all of you. So to Patrick, I want to ask about queer family and politics of friendship and in relation to this, the family and the politics of friendship as a critique of family structures and patriarchy, sectarianism, and everything. Could you elaborate? Because you passed really quickly on that. Could you elaborate on that? And to Jad, I really don't understand if you're using the West as an analytical concept or not. I wonder, now we see in the West, Donald Trump is anti-gay. He's the West. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the West, the fact that the West is not a monolithic category? And Raya? Maha, sorry. ما فهمتش انت عم تقولي انه هاي حالة مرضية ولا ما فهمتش عليكي؟
انا حضرتك عرضت كما عرضتها المقالات، يعني دي النتائج اللي انا وصلت لها كيف يتعامل. انا اسف.
Yeah. So هذا السؤال. Okay. So مش مشكلة. Next. I'll go back and then front. Okay. Now, yeah. Oh no, it's a problem. This is the.
Yeah, my name is Nadia Ali, I'm from SARS. Maha, I was wondering if you are familiar with the work of Noor Al-Qasimi and in how far your work builds on it or challenges, or how does it engage with her work?
Noor Al-Qasimi?
Noor Al-Qasimi, who has worked on Bayat.
Yeah, Noor Al-Qasimi.
So I was wondering whether both Jake and Patrick could tell us how do you define queer discourse, and I guess particularly to Judd, I was very confused about the way you used queer. So in my mind, you were at some point conflating, I guess, what I would think of the sort of gay international and queer. Sometimes we were conflating LGBT activism and queer, and then sometimes we were speaking about Judith Butler and queer theory. So I was wondering if, I guess both of you, I would be interested if you could tell us about what you mean by Western queer discourse, what you mean by queer theory, and what is the relationship between LGBT activism and queer activism?
Okay. You had your hand up, and then I'll go. Yes. Oh, I see. I'm like, I thought you couldn't see.
بس سؤالي لمها أول شيء.
اسمك؟
اسمي لما الخطيب من Open Society Foundations. بدي أشكرك معها على البرزنتيشن اللي عطيتيه، بس عندي مشكلة أنا بالمنهجية تبعتك أو يعني النقطة اللي أنت عم تنطلقي منها، لأنك يمكن جاوبتي جزء من السؤال إنه أنت وصفتي كيف في تغطية إعلامية للبويات، بس كمان حتى أنت أشرتي لهم كظاهرة، يعني هل أنت بتتعاملي معهم كمشكلة موجودة بدنا نحلل أسبابها ونلاقي لها حل، ولا هم جزء من، يعني أنت إذا تعطينا بس أكثر عن وجهة نظرك، يعني هل بتشوفيهم هم جزء، يعني أفراد بالمجتمع موجودين لهم اختيارات معينة، سلوك أو ميول يعني زيهم زي باقي أعضاء المجتمع، ولا أنت بتشوفيهم إنهم هم فئة منعزلة وإحنا عم نحللها من هذا المنطلق؟ وكمان قلتي إنه كان مش مسموح إنك تجري حوارات معهم، يعني كانت العينة كثير قليلة لأنه مش مسموح، إنه شو كانت مين اللي ما منع إجراء الحوارات، أو شو كانت يعني الأوبستكلز اللي واجهتيها؟
Okay. We'll do another round, but I'm going to do one more, which I saw your hand first.
I'm Hind. I'm from Kuwait University, and my question is for Maha. I might need help translating some of what I'm trying to say here. So, to follow up on the question before this, your presentation is, I mean, I don't know where to start, to be honest. Like, this is an extremely violent discourse. You're alluding to gay and queer people as a phenomenon. You're talking about articles. Yes, I understand that you haven't authored them, but you're recirculating and reproducing that violence here. Do we really need to sit and hear that queer people are a result of neglect and bad TV or like foreign TV? What's the use of this? And even like the use of the word boya itself, I'm aware of someone brought up Noor's work, and yes, that's valid, but she relies on people who self-identify as boyat. But in Kuwaiti society, the word is a slur, it's derogatory, so why are you using it? Like, if people want to use it to refer to themselves, that's fine. But as with any minority who have had slurs used against them, we don't recirculate that if we're not members of that community. So how can you come here and talk about boyat? Like, that's absolutely confounding to me.
Thank you. So what we'll do now is we'll take, the panelists will respond. So بدك تبدي ولا أبدأ مع حاضرة تبدي؟ أوكي. So بدك إذا ممكن يعني تجاوبي كل الأسئلة اللي كانت إلك. يلا تفضلي.
يعني يمكن السؤال 2 انا وجهه نظري ايه؟
أعلى.
اوكي انا وجهه نظري ايه؟ انا موضوعيه جاي اعرض الموضوع وتناول المقالات لهذه الظاهره. لو على المستوى الشخصي يعني سؤال شخصي بقى مش على مستوى البحث. طبعا كل انسان له حريه، انا مقتنعه بكده تماما ان كل انسان له حريه ان هو يختار الهويه التي يريد ويعيش على اساسها. يمكن انا كده جاوبت حضرتك على سؤالك ان هو انا اؤمن، لكن انا جايه بعرض ان هذه يعني ظاهره او قضيه او فئه او اقليه او موجوده، وبعرض بس كيف يتم تناولها اعلاميا يعني. اوكي. بالنسبه لنورا القاسمي مش عارفه هل من اسمها انا صراحه يعني ركزت على دراستي على المجتمعين، ما درستش الظاهره. اعتقد من اسمها ان هي من الامارات.
عندها دكتوراه.
من الامارات. فانا يعني حقيقي انا ما درستش عشان ابقى يعني انا ما درستش الظاهره في المجتمع الاماراتي. عندي شويه يعني يعني مش عارفه برضو يمكن عشان الانجليزي وحضرتك بتتكلمي بسرعه، فلو ممكن ابقى يعني حضرتك تقولي لي بالظبط يعني السؤال.
هحاول اشرح.
طيب اوكي.
طيب الكلمه هي بويا يعني هذه صفه ما نستخدمها بطريقه شنو عكس سلبيه؟ ايجابيه. يعني هي مو كلمه ايجابيه. في بعض الناس من ال LGBT groups they use it يعني they proclaim it. بس الناس اللي برا هالجروب لما انت تستخدمينها هذا فيها يعني كميه عنف وطاقه سلبيه، يعني مو المفروض انت تستخدمينها. حتى يعني نور هذه اللي كتبت هالمقاله تكلمت عن ناس هم they identify as boyat. فهذا موضوع ثاني، ان احنا نيجي نتكلم عن الناس هذول كل الناس اللي بالمقالات كلها هذه قاعد يتكلمون عنهم بطريقه يعني جدا سلبيه. يعني هذه لما تقولي عن واحده بويا this is not a good thing, it's never going to be a good thing. Maybe it will be, but in Kuwaiti society الحين مو شيء يعني شيء سلبي وفي عنف. يعني اوكي انت ما قاعد هذا مو رايك، بس انت قاعد تطرحين الكلام، فليش نتعرض يعني هالعنف مره ثانيه؟ شنو نستفادها؟ يعني في وايد فئات there's so much racism against them. هل احنا الحين مين نطرح نقول هالفئه X, Y and Z just بس عشان نرد نشوف العرض؟ احنا يعني I'm trying to get at يعني شنو الحين المغزى من كلامك؟
يمكن يعني هي موجوده اصلا في اللي هي في استخدامي النظريه اللي هي الواقعيه النسويه اللي هي ان احنا لما احنا بنتكلم على فئه، فده اللي لما ادخل في التجربه اللي هي عاشتها واتعمق فيها ده بيعمل يعني وصولا الى التغيير المجتمعي اللي كانت بتحصل اصلا في المرحله الثانيه من النسويه. عشان كده اللي هي يعني كمرحله للتغيير المجتمعي، سواء كان هم هناك زي ما انت بتقولي رافضين، او زي ما البحث بيقول رافضين ويحدث تغيير، او اللي هو مزيد من، لان يعني النتائج انت بتقولي في يعني انا شايفه ان في يعني الرفض ده متضمن قبول. يمكن انا طلعت ده في النتائج، يعني ان الرفض الظاهره فيها قبول وفيها برضو من القراءه ان هو بدا كان في حد في البرلمان، انا بس يعني مش فاكره ان هو قال ان هو يبداوا يبقى لهم اصوات وكده. فدي وجهه يعني بحث حبيت يعني اشتغل عليه. وزي ما قلت لك لان الظاهره او الموضوع ده ما كانش او القضيه او الفئه او اي ما تسميها، بس هي عموما لها مسميات في كل الدنيا. ما هي بالانجلش هم يعني مثلا جيز في لسبك بالانجلش يعني.
Okay, so for now, خلينا let's keep going.
Okay, no problem.
I just want you
يعني ده
to
اعتقد كده ان انا
بس خلصتي كل جاوبتي كل شيء اللي okay, so we'll continue, but تفضل.
Thank you for your questions. They're actually quite good criticisms. So I think I just felt like they could be combined together in the same answer. So when it comes to the West, I do agree. This was like the main criticism I made to myself within my limitations, that generalization can happen quite easily. And it's not only from the Middle Eastern side, but it's also from the Western side, because even in the West, you have these different experiences where certain individuals are not even accepted in the community. Let's say if we're talking about someone from, just like a random example from, let's say, rural Milwaukee, and they come out as trans, they don't necessarily gonna be accepted in the community. And which is why I just tried to limit it to Western queer discourse, which is why like I wasn't talking about in the West, like all the homophobia and the discourse that comes out from, for example, the Westboro Baptist Church or people like Donald Trump. So I tried to limit it to just the concepts that come in within the LGBT community that is predominant in the lexicon and in the behavior in that part of the world. So yes, I completely agree with you. When it comes to queerness, I also agree with you that there was definitely a certain conflation when it comes to the terminology. And I definitely glossed over it in my presentation quite quickly. In my research, I actually expanded a lot on it. So I started just with queer theory. So for the sake of the paper, I only used queer theory to define performativity, and I did not use it. If I did in my presentation, I apologize, but I did not use it within the research itself. It was just only to define what queer performativity meant, coming from Judith Butler's definition of performativity in general. Just to establish that there was a certain queer performance and culture that came out from the West. Then for the conflation when it comes to LGBT, from LGBT activism and queer and gay internationalism and queer, I used queer mainly for its political term, for the political aspect that comes with queerness, and not to specifically use one aspect of it. Like, yes, queer as a term is an umbrella term, and it's a gray term. You can use it in different aspects. You can use it as a verb, as an adjective, and as a noun. That's just grammatically speaking. And then when it comes to actual terminology, queerness can either mean a queer individual that doesn't want to identify according to certain labels. Like, you can be someone who abides by, like, you're a male who has sex with other males but still identify as queer. It can be used in terms of gender as well, and not necessarily sexuality. So yes, there is definitely this sense of vagueness when it comes to the term queer in my research, but this was like the main point. It was just for the political aspect of it. I hope this answers the question. Yes? No?
If you think it did, then
I think it
it
does.
did. We're going to open it up a little more.
Yeah.
Okay, so Patra.
All right. Also, thank you for your questions. I believe you asked about the politics of friendship and so I believe you asked about the politics of friendship, and if I can talk more about how that queers heteronormative familial structures. Thank you for asking that. I actually want to talk more about that, but due to the limitations of time, I couldn't. But I wanted to reiterate that throughout Kool-Aid's, Alam ad-Din creates a rift between Muhammad and his father, and this is noteworthy because, first of all, it is very similar to other post-war Lebanese fiction in that the question of the father is always presented, but also the fact is the father does not represent only the familial structure. He represents heteronormativity within the family. He also represents citizenship. As we all know that if that a person is only Lebanese, if their father is Lebanese, their citizenship is constituted through the patriarch. So I understood it to mean that the critique against the father would ultimately leads to a critique against the fatherland. So Alam ad-Din throughout his book critiques this image of the nation through the critique against the father, and more specifically when Muhammad, the character, moves to the US and he gets outed, it creates a larger rift with the rest of his family in Lebanon except his sister. And that was the turning point that led to the creation of the queer family. So it's not that the politics of friendship itself critiques the family structure, but the politics of friendship, or friendship as a way of life, as Foucault would put it, creates these queer kinship ties, and these queer kinship ties are the ones that criticize or pose a threat to the heteronormative family structure. And I also wanted to also talk about the difference between LGBT and queer for me. So obviously I say LGBT activism. What I mean, activism around issues of gender, sex, and sexuality. I also used, I think, gay AIDS activism, but what I actually mean is sexual health activism, specifically done by MSM, for MSM, men who have sex with men, to MSM, men who have sex with men. I do agree that sometimes I might use queer to designate anything that is non-normative, whether sexually or gender-based. But I don't remember if I mentioned here. Anyway, thank you for your questions.
Okay, I'm going to take 4 more, and I'm going to start with Sarah.
Yeah.
Yes, I just let me. Yes, just let me do. Yeah. So can you introduce yourself though? I want you. Yeah. You stayed in my head after the last 4, so you're first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my question.
And if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Murad, assistant professor of media studies at AUB. So my question mainly is for Jad and Maha. Maha, I want to start with you. You mentioned feminist standpoint theory as the methodological grounding of your work. I couldn't see how this came through in your actual data analysis and the way you went about researching your topic. As you were describing your disposition or your orientation towards the subject in an objective manner, that sort of completely demolishes the subjectivity that is inherent in feminist standpoint theory. So this is one. So if you can speak more about this objective and where you see the feminist standpoint theory helping you conceptualize the phenomenon that you're studying. I am reminded of, rather than feminist standpoint theory or feminist research, your approach reminded me more of a sociology of deviance kind of approach, which played an important role at a certain historical moment of normalizing deviant behavior by objectifying it into a legitimate project for knowledge production and scholarship. But so if you can clarify the feminism there and what you took from feminism, especially because I was, when in one of your slides, when you mention feminism, you say that in the second wave feminist, there was a sort of dismissal of genderqueer women. And this is also a claim that has to be challenged because this was part of an ongoing political struggle among feminist groups. For Jad, you talk about Western queer discourse, but somehow we fail to see the agency of local self-identified queers. And yes, there was a certain definitional, murkiness. You use queer in different ways. The part I think was missing was this non-normative impulse of using the word queer rather than an identitarian claim as a sort of, as you mentioned, a political disposition against norms writ large, right? So maybe say more also about local queer discourse and what that looks like. Thank you.
Okay. More? Okay. Yes. Name?
Maya. مايا الحلو. أول شيء بس مها في بس بعتقد في مشكلة بالترمينولوجي كمان غير كلمة بياض في conflation بين شو يعني متحول شو يعني gay شو يعني lesbian gender identity و sexuality فبعتقد هذه كانت بعتقد إنه فيك تطلع على هدول الترمينولوجيز ويمكن يساعدوك كمان بالاناليسيس تبعك. تاني شيء جاد أنا I will build on what Sarah was saying. I am very uncomfortable with how you described يعني how you kind of robbed agency from the queers in the Middle East. I have a problem also with using queer yet again in another conference to talk about gay men. Queer is not about gay men. Queer is emerged from a place where feminism actually used it as a critique of a lot of other things, but that also. So if you would like to think through your paper that way. In addition, what is the Middle East? Yani, I know in the West the Middle East is very like, they understand what the Middle East. I don't. We are in Beirut. What is the Middle East really? Yani, if we're talking about Beirut, then what you are talking about might in some cases apply for queers in Beirut. Not that I agree with that analysis, but might, okay? But is it Middle East Egypt? Is it Middle East, yani, where is the Middle East? Is it Syria? Is it Palestine? What Middle East are we talking about? Yani, it doesn't apply even like in the peripheries. Thank you.
Okay, third person. I'm going to have you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm from the Graduate Center CUNY, and thank you all for interesting panels. I just have a quick question for Jad. I was curious when you were creating this monolithic West versus East situation, when two of your major interlocutors, Sofian Mourabit and Salim Haddad, are both mixed-race individuals who were primarily raised in the West, and not in, say, Lebanon or Syria or Palestine or elsewhere, using them as the quote-unquote authentic voice of a queer grouping. And I'm also curious that you always use the singular, an atomistic sense of queer across whatever this Middle East may be or whatever it contains, when there is such a difference of discourses, maybe simultaneous but not synchronic, taking place, say, in Egypt or in Cairo or in Beirut or elsewhere. And when you're doing this, obviously, I agree with the lack of gender being mentioned earlier. It's very bizarre with using queer. But I was also wondering why you never mentioned class. The experiences of a upper middle class individual in Beirut is very different from, say, a working class member in Tripoli or in Beirut itself. And I'm just curious why that was never an actual issue in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, one more question or comment that I did see hands earlier. I saw here. Okay, let's just go then. Well, let me throw in one. I just wanted to, sorry, now I have way too many notes. Yeah, I just thought Jad Musa, right? Yeah. Yeah, I just want to build on the binary problem, I think, that is set up in just a productive challenge, right? And so, and I think you're right on this question of I mean, it's the scale at which you were, maybe the scale at which you were, actually maybe there's a scale issue in all three papers. So the scale at which the discussion happens, actually, let's say, kind of objectifying in this case, and at the literary, level, at the theoretical queer theory level, essentially means that it's, it produces its own kinds of results. But I would definitely, having sort of widely read, let's say, transnational, non-normative sexuality studies in multiple disciplines, I would definitely say be careful with the West, the West versus East kind of way. And I would agree with the person who talked about what is the Middle East. Maya, yeah, definitely, because if we just follow some of this scholarship. So let's open it to the panelists, and this time I'd like to start with Patrick and come forward. Patrick.
Yes. So you mentioned the question of scale. So you mentioned the question of scale. I think that was your comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you don't have to begin with me. You can begin with, you had three other.
No, I didn't.
He did.
Okay, go on.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that you might do have a point. I'm thinking now that even though what I'm conducting here is more of a literary analysis of a novel, but I believe that it does provide insight into dealing with the question of community building, which is NGOized versus a politics of shared estrangement, the politics of friendship. So that's where I'm coming from. Obviously, this might pose problems when you try to take this argument and try to apply it elsewhere outside of the book. But I would argue that it might be possible in another paper, actually.
One person asked you about the character. Was that for you? About the characters, the protagonist, or was that for Mike? Okay.
Yeah. So, Chad?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your questions again. I want to start with the easiest one, I guess. What is the Middle East? Also, something I glossed over quickly was that I only mentioned queer Beirut, but I did also get ethnographies from writers who wrote about Palestine and a bit in Syria. But I do agree that the terminology of using the Middle East in the paper was probably incorrect because it's such a broad term as well. So thank you on that comment. So I just want to go back to the queer shouldn't be used for gay men. I think, in my personal opinion, is queerness is a term that doesn't abide by rules and doesn't abide by who is allowed to define themselves as queer. And I clearly state that my paper is not only about gay men, it's also about any individual, like any man that has sex with other men, and that doesn't necessarily make them gay, because you have bisexual men, you have trans men, and you do have a point at a certain sense when it comes to queerness, but you can't just say that queerness is not for gay men, because since queer is a political term, and if you want to define yourself as such, then do you have a reply? You said queer shouldn't be used for gay men. This is exactly what you said.
I think she was meaning.
I wasn't using. No, but I wasn't using he to only identify as men. It was only a grammar point. I'm not gonna. I apologize if it was offensive, but I'm not. I personally did not want to use he, she every single time. Maybe I should have used they in that sense. I apologize. Okay, for the monolithic West, for the voice of Salim and Sufyan, I did mention that there is a huge centricity of the West when it comes to discussing the discourse of Arab identity in general. And yes, Sufyan and Salim are two people that were not raised in the Middle East, and they do abide by that. But I wasn't necessarily making them the voice of the Middle Eastern people. I was just using Sufyan's work because it was the only ethnography that was quite extensive on a longer period of time that I could find in the moment itself. More research should be done by me, by other people as well. And I did mention class quite quickly. I should have expanded on it as well. I do agree that class plays a way bigger role because experiences and narratives in Beirut are completely different than people who were raised in Zahle, for example, or in Tripoli or in Saida. And the dynamics change completely, especially from a metropolitan city like Beirut, where you have access to these certain communities that will support you versus someone like me who was raised in Zahle, where there was no access to any of that throughout the 2000s and even today. Sorry, I'm just still looking at the questions. There was the question as well about the comment about stealing agency of local queers. I also agree that there was not specific, I wasn't specifying at all what happens on the local level. And there's definitely a lot of mobilization and a lot of organizations that do work for the definition of queerness or gayness, however we want to define it, in our own term and not according to Western terms. And yes, this was not mentioned in the paper at all. It was again the sociology that I was using was based on just just non-activist behavior of Arab men in Beirut, like as based in Sufyan Mirabet's Queer Beirut, where he doesn't necessarily indulge or dive deeply into, like, for example, the work of Helm or other organizations. I think there's just still the monolithic West versus East. Yes, this is another generalization as well, but I think it was Kenneth Waltz who said that theories have to be general and they're always going to have exceptions, and this is just another theory, in my opinion. So yes.
Can I challenge you on that?
Yeah, sure.
So, and it relates to the kinship question and what you just said about Zahle. I know very little about Lebanon, so don't assume anything there other than what I read. And this is only my second visit to the country. But let's just say where your community is from. So when you talk about, a community, so the research that kind of looks at race and class transnationally and sexuality and gender finds that there are costs to a kind of individualistic, you lose more than you gain. You might lose more than you gain. And that's the question. So, for example, in the context of Australia, the United States, New York City, Martin Manella and Sam, looking at people who are citizens, not citizens, poor white people. So I think that, there's actually an analytical link, and there is theorization by people of color and transnational feminist scholars, and I agree with the person who said that, like, queer theory came out of feminist debates, and in those debates, people of color and working class people and sexuality, they were always there. And so I would just say it might be deeper, so by staying at the scale of queer theory at some meta, it ends up being kind of white and pretty privileged, and I'm in that privileged academy. I'm just saying certain questions are foreclosed and certain lenses are foreclosed. But ultimately, I agree that it needs deep kind of engagement with whatever local means, local kinds of texts. Okay, last, do it.
3 minutes is we need to break for lunch.
And then 3 دقايق. انتي go.
بالنسبه لحضرتك بتقولي انا الانطلاق اللي هي استخدمتها ازاي اللي هي نظريه الموقعيه، ده يعني كان الموضوع ان انا انطلقت منها على اساس ان انا اشوف هل فعلا المقالات بتوضح ان هذه عايزه اقول لك ان هي هذه الافكار الموقعيه اللي بتهتم بدراسه التجارب، وبالتالي الاختلافات والتركيز على الذات اللي موجود عند التركيز على الذات اللي المفروض يكون موجود في في الدراسات. عايزه اعرف هل هي فعلا موجوده ولا مش موجوده. وزي ما قلت انا بحثي استكشافي، انا لسه مقدمه ممكن يكون لابحاث تانية توضح الموضوع اكتر. بالنسبه ما استعنتش بالثقافه، انا كنت اللي هي نظريات الانحراف الاجتماعي، ده لان فضلت ان انا اخد الموضوع من زي ما قلت كده من مقاربه نسويه. ثقافه الانحراف هتخليني اخد الموضوع يبقى حكمت على الموضوع. انا اكدت ان انا بعرض الموضوع بموضوعيه كما وجد في التناول الاعلامي. اوكي، ده تمام. في اي حاجه تانية انا وقعت مني ولا كده الامور اوكي تمام؟ بالنسبه في قصه الترمينولوجي، اعتقد ان انا قرات فيها ما والامور ممكن تكون الوقت محدد ان انا اعرض كل الافكار او اعرض كمقارنات، وازاي ان هو في تصنيف لها اللي هم في 10 راحل. ما اعتقدش ان هو كان الوقت يسمح. انا كان كل هدفي وزي ما قلت كده حتى من العنوان، حتى ما كانش يعني سب تايتل او حاجه، لا ده العنوان الرئيس ان هو ايه اللي هو التناول الاعلامي، كيف تم تناول الظاهره. ما دخلتش كتير فعلا في المصطلحات رغم البحث عن تقريبا حاجه و30 صفحه يعني، فاكيد متعرضه لده كله. فممكن يعني لما البحث كامل او نتناقش فيه او ان هو ازاي يعني ونتكلم مع بعض، مفيش مشكله خلاص. شكرا.
Thank you to the panelists and thank